The Coleman mansion was unusually silent that morning. No sound of laughter, no trace of life, only the steady ticking of a clock echoing through the emptiness. Then, something faint, fragile as a breath, cut through the air. Mommy. The leather briefcase slipped from Richard's hand, landing on the marble floor with a cold, hollow thud, like the sound of a heart cracking open. He froze at the doorway, eyes wide in disbelief. On the carpet in the middle of the room, his twin sons, the boys the doctors had once declared would never speak, were moving their lips, looking toward the black housemaid. Cynthia was still in her black and white uniform, yellow rubber gloves still on. She knelt beside them, trembling, her voice barely a whisper. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy's right here." And then again, that word, clearer now, warmer. Mommy. No medicine, no machine, no miracle of science had ever achieved what just happened. Richard stepped back, his heart pounding wildly. He, the man who could buy anything, power, reputation, the illusion of control, now stood helpless, watching a woman his world deemed inferior do what all his wealth and privilege could not. Something had just awakened in a house that had long been dead. In that moment, the word mommy still echoed in Richard's mind like a sound that didn't belong to this world. He stood there for a long time, unsure if he was dreaming or awake. Those two children, the little souls the doctors had sentenced to a lifetime of silence, had just shattered fate itself with a single word. A word he had waited 4 years to hear. Yet it came from another's voice. And then, as if an invisible door swung open, memory flooded in. That day, the hospital reeked of disinfectant. The heart monitor beeped its final notes. His wife Eleanor lay on the delivery bed, her hand growing cold in his. The twins came into the world with weak cries, and she never opened her eyes again. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Coleman," the doctor said quietly. "They were born with permanent neurological damage. They will never walk. They will never speak." From that day on, Richard lived like a shadow inside his own mansion. Every morning, the clock struck at the same hour. Breakfast was placed in the same position, and 2 small wheelchairs stood neatly by the window. He turned grief into routine, silence into order, as if perfection could keep destiny under control. But the truth was, he was only running away from the sound of his own heart breaking in the dark. No one heard music in that house anymore. The tall glass walls reflected a cold man with hollow eyes, and 2 motionless children, pale as wax figures. People called him Richard Coleman, the Iron Father. He never cried. He never spoke softly. But that morning, when the word mommy echoed again, the ice around his heart cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough for the first light to slip through. And in that fragile, trembling instant, Richard realized maybe this house wasn't dead after all. Maybe what he thought was a miracle was only the beginning. That word, mommy, though it had lasted only a few fleeting seconds, lingered like an open wound in Richard's mind. For days afterward, he couldn't shake the image of his 2 sons moving their lips, or the black woman kneeling beside them. There was something in her eyes that day, a tenderness touched by fear, that unsettled him, even angered him. He didn't believe in miracles, and he certainly didn't believe that a maid who had been in his house for less than 3 weeks could accomplish what medicine had declared impossible. Cynthia had arrived at the Coleman mansion on a gray morning, carrying an old suitcase and walking softly, as if afraid to disturb the stillness that clung to the house. She was unlike anyone who had ever worked for Richard. Not sycophantic, not timid, not cold, just quiet. She spoke little, worked much. Each morning she opened the windows to let sunlight spill into rooms long accustomed to darkness. When she cleaned the children's room, she often paused, talking gently to them, though she knew they could not respond. Her voice, soft as breath, warm as early winter sun, seemed to touch a place in the house's silence that no one else ever had. And within days, something strange began to happen. The twins, who had never reacted to light, to sound, or to the therapist's voice, began to stir slightly whenever Cynthia was near. Their eyes grew less vacant. A faint, fragile smile flickered across Daniel's lips, something medicine had labeled impossible. From a distance, Richard watched, caught between suspicion and fear. He didn't want to believe what he saw. How could a simple woman, with hands that smelled of soap and a voice untrained and plain, shake the cold, ordered world he had spent years constructing? But as the evening light slanted through the tall windows and fell upon Cynthia's gentle smile, Richard realized, for the first time in a very long while, there was warmth in this house again. A warmth no money could buy, no logic could measure. A warmth that only hearts once broken could ever bring. When night fell over the Reed mansion, everything seemed to slow down. But in the upstairs room, where the soft glow of a bedside lamp brushed against two innocent faces, something had changed. After months of silence, Richard's twin sons laughed, a short, hoarse, trembling laugh, yet enough to make their father freeze in the doorway, his heart pounding as if he had just heard something impossible. Cynthia sat beside them, head bowed, humming a lullaby as her brown hands gently stroked the boy's hair. Her voice was low, warm, as though it were stitching together invisible wounds that medicine could never touch. And when the song ended, Richard, the man who once believed money could buy miracles, found himself stepping into his first real conversation with the woman who might change his entire life. "What did you do to them?" Richard asked, his voice cold, slicing through the tender stillness of the room. Cynthia turned to him. Her eyes caught the lamplight, not fearful, only quietly sincere. "I just talked to them," she said softly, sang to them, held their hands when they trembled. Richard clenched his fists. "You think that's all it takes?" Cynthia smiled faintly, as if the truth needed no argument. "Maybe, sir. Maybe they just need to feel safe." A long silence followed. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window, like the heartbeat of the house slowing down. In Richard's world, a world built on logic, numbers, and wealth, her words were absurd. A black housemaid, with no degree, no prestige, daring to tell him that love could do what a dozen of the country's best doctors could not. "Do your job, Cynthia," he said curtly, his voice low. But as he turned to leave, he heard her whisper behind him, "Someone who doesn't give up on them." That single sentence, like a tiny seed, sank deep into the hollow part of a man who had long since died alongside his own pain. And that night, for the first time in years, Richard could not sleep. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Cynthia's words, "Maybe they just need to feel safe," kept playing in his mind like a song with no end. He didn't believe in miracles, and he certainly didn't believe in simplicity. But the next morning, as he walked past the children's room, he stopped. A voice, soft, familiar, froze him in place. Cynthia was singing. Her voice was tender, aching, reaching into a part of Richard's memory he had spent years trying to bury. That song, it was the lullaby his wife used to sing when she was pregnant. The same melody, the same rhythm, even the same way she lingered on certain words. He stood motionless at the doorway, eyes fixed on the black woman gently humming, her hands resting on the twins' small hands. And then, the impossible happened. The boy's lips quivered. A distorted sound slipped out, trembling, fragile, but real. Then came his sister. The twins, once declared beyond recovery, were speaking, for the first time in 2 years. Cynthia broke down in tears. Richard stumbled back, heart racing wildly, torn between awe and fear, as if witnessing something beyond human understanding. Later, he discovered that the answer had been there all along. Inside something small and unassuming. His wife's old notebook. Cynthia had found it in the storage room. On the cover, written in shaky blue ink, were the words, "For when I'm not there." Inside were lullabies, notes, and words a mother had written for the children she knew she would never live to raise. Cynthia had no idea whose it was. She had simply sung from it, instinctively, lovingly. But in doing so, she brought a miracle to life, her voice carrying the warmth of a mother back into a house long frozen in grief. Richard knelt, trembling, as he touched his child's tiny hand. Through the melody, his tears fell freely, and for the first time in 2 years, he heard the sound he had prayed for, a faint, innocent whisper of Daddy. The vast mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. It was filled instead with music. From the past, from love, from an unseen woman doing what no doctor, no amount of money ever could. The miracle of that night did not fade with the morning light. It stayed, quietly threading itself through every corner of the house, in the breaths of the 2 children, in the astonished eyes of Richard. But to him, the true miracle was not that his children could speak. It was the haunting question that followed. Why could a stranger reach my children when I could not? From that day on, Richard began to watch Cynthia more closely. He gave no orders, no instructions. He simply stood behind the doorway, silent, watching her read to the twins in a voice soft as morning wind. Each time she laughed, the room seemed to glow. And the children laughed too, their trembling hands reaching toward her as if to hold the light itself. And that's when Richard realized he had never truly seen his children. For 2 years, he had looked at them not as lives to be loved, but as wounds to be hidden, not as souls waiting to be held, but as tragedies to be managed. In his eyes, they were reminders of loss. In Cynthia's, they were simply children, in need of someone's arms. One evening, while tidying his late wife's room, Richard found a page tucked between the folds of her old journal. The handwriting was tilted, familiar. Love can still reach them, even when words cannot. He sat there for a long time. Outside, Cynthia's voice floated through the halls again, softly singing the twins to sleep. Each line of her lullaby felt like a thread, binding the living to the memory of the dead. That night, Richard sat by his children's bed. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about medical charts, business meetings, or what he had lost. He simply placed his hand over his child's chest, feeling the small heartbeat under his palm. In the dim yellow light, a tear slipped down his cheek. Warm, alive, he whispered, as if speaking to someone who was still there. Love doesn't die. It's only forgotten. And today, you helped me remember. The mansion was silent. No more crying. No more wind howling through the windows. Only the steady rhythm of 2 tiny hearts. Slow, gentle, healing from within. After that night, Richard changed. He didn't say a word, but the house could feel it. The morning light that slipped through the window seemed softer. The faint laughter of the 2 children returned. Awkward, broken, but real. Cynthia still came every day, bringing with her the scent of cheap soap and the warmth this cold mansion had never known. Richard no longer just watched. He listened. He learned to be silent, to hear life speak in another language, through breaths, through smiles, through heartbeats. Then came the storm. Rain hammered violently against the roof. Wind howled through the long corridors, shaking the framed paintings on the wall. Everything seemed to return to where it began. Darkness, fear, loneliness. The lights went out. The 2 children began to panic, their tiny bodies trembling. Richard rushed toward them, but before he could reach out, a voice rose amid the rain. Shh, it's okay, baby. I'm here. Cynthia, still in her soaked uniform, knelt down on the floor, wrapping the 2 children in her arms. She sang softly, her trembling voice blending with the thunder. Then, in a flash of lightning, Richard heard it. clear as a blade cutting into his heart. Sin, Sin. The children were calling her name. Not Mommy. Not anything else. But Sin, Cynthia's familiar nickname. The world stood still. Richard stepped back, breath caught in his throat. That call, so simple yet proof of something he had never believed in. That the human heart, no matter what's taken from it, still knows how to love. When the storm passed, Richard came to her, his voice rough and low. How did you? Cynthia looked at him, calm, steady, but deep. Because I know what it feels like to be forgotten. That's why I show up. The words were light as wind, yet they shattered everything Richard had ever believed about worth, about class, about color. Outside, dawn began to break. Sunlight slipped through the wet curtains, falling on 3 faces. 2 white children and 1 black woman, all smiling in the warmth after the storm. That night, it wasn't just the rain that stopped. A man had finally begun to awaken. After the storm, the Coleman mansion seemed cleansed of all its old darkness. The first light of morning poured through the windows, glimmering on the rain-soaked wooden floor. No more howling wind, no more suffocating silence, only the gentle sounds of breathing, of life. Richard stood in the hallway, watching Cynthia tuck in the blankets for the 2 children still fast asleep. The morning light touched her face, tired yet peaceful. In that moment, he understood something he had never realized before. Some people aren't born to save the world. They're born to save a single home. And she, the black woman once seen as the help, was the miracle God had sent. That day, as Cynthia was packing her things to leave, Richard called softly, "Cynthia, stay," not as a maid anymore, but as part of the family. She froze, still holding her worn cloth bag. Her eyes glistened. Before she could answer, the 2 children ran toward her, holding her hands tightly and calling out, this time without trembling, without hesitation. "Mommy," the word echoed through the house. But this time, it wasn't the echo of pain. It was the sound of acceptance, of love, the sound of souls coming back to life. Richard bent down, his voice breaking in the warmth that filled the room. "You brought them back to me." Cynthia only smiled, her eyes wet but shining, as she watched the children wrap their arms around him, a sight he had once thought he'd never see again. That afternoon, the house that had buried so many memories was filled with laughter. The old piano played again, its tone rough but warm as a heartbeat. By the window, 3 people, 2 skin colors, 3 destinies, stood together. No one said a word, but they all knew. Family isn't born of blood. It's reborn through faith, through love, and through the moment people truly see one another, beyond color, beyond fear. The house that was once hauntingly silent now breathed. It lived, and somewhere, in the golden glow of the evening sun, Richard's late wife was surely smiling. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the glass windows, casting a golden hue over a freshly taken family photo. In it, Richard stood at the center, the 2 children clinging to his legs, and Cynthia, the woman who once stood on the margins of the house, now stood beside them, her smile gentle yet radiant. No one said a word, but they all knew. Something sacred had changed forever. Cynthia still wore her old rubber gloves, still tied the frayed apron around her waist. But every time she smiled, the house seemed to brighten. People still called her the Maid, but to Michael and Daniel, she was a miracle. The first voice that awakened sound within 2 silent souls. Once, a wealthy guest visiting the mansion asked in surprise, "Who is she, that the children cling to her like that?" Richard simply replied, softly, without turning his head, "The one who reminded me what it means to be a father." Outside, the wind brushed through the trees. In the quiet breathing of the house, one could feel something greater than wealth, power, or reputation. Something only those who've been broken truly understand. The presence of a heart that knows how to love. Cynthia was no doctor, no psychologist. She was just an ordinary black woman, seen by the world with condescension, yet capable of touching the one place science could not reach, the human heart. She did not heal with medicine, but with patience, with her embrace, with the simple act of staying when everyone else had walked away. Richard once believed that love was fragile, useless against the harshness of life. But now he understood. Love never dies. It is only forgotten. And it was Cynthia, the smallest figure in that great house, who rekindled its flame. The story doesn't end with applause, but with silence. The gentle silence of awakening. Because in a world divided by color, class, and prejudice, there are still small souls like Cynthia, quietly lighting the dark. No titles, no power, just presence. And you? Between Richard, the man who learned to love again, and Cynthia, the woman who never stopped loving, who touched your heart more?